This is the Cruciform Conversations podcast, where we explore the healing and transforming love of God and seek to be peacemakers and reconcilers in a fractured world. I'm your host, Greg Arthur. To find out more and engage in the conversation, make sure you subscribe to the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com. Well, welcome to Cruciform Conversations. My name is Greg Arthur, and today I'm in conversation with Dr. Frank Woggon, and we are going to take a deep dive into his fascinating book, The Empathic God. I'm writing about this a lot, talking about it a lot, going to highly recommend it to people, but we're going to really dig into it. Thank you so much for joining me today, Frank, taking time out of your really busy schedule to help me dig into some of these ideas I found so fascinating.
Glad to dig in with you, Greg. Thanks for having me.
So just a little bit of Frank's background. He's a Baptist minister ordained in the German Baptist Union. He studied theology at the Seminary of the German Baptist Convention in Hamburg, Germany. For most of his professional life, worked as a healthcare chaplain, as a clinical educator in spiritual care. Did a PhD program in Louisville, Kentucky, and pastored a Baptist congregation in Berlin for 4 years. He's a board-certified chaplain in the Association of Professional Chaplains and serves as the Director of Chaplaincy Services at the University of Louisville Health and works in clinical pastoral education as well. So he has a wide range of background theologically, but especially in clinical care and clinical education, which comes through intensely in the book. And I think provides really helpful for context for wrestling with our theology. So this is what really drew me into it. I think this book is one of the best contextual theologies I've read in a long time. So we're going to dig into what clinical theology is and try to make sense of some of the ideas here. So Frank, let's just start there. You described yourself as a clinical theologian. I'll be honest, that was a slightly new term for me, and it got me excited. I like when I encounter a new, different type of theologian. So what is clinical theology? And maybe give us a little bit of understanding about how your experience, your work, your background has helped shape some of that theology in your context.
Yeah. It's my way of claiming my context, because I don't do theological reflection in an academic context. I do it as part of as a clinician of spiritual care, providing spiritual care in the hospital. So I do it as part of my work as a chaplain and as an educator of chaplains. And typically when I use the term clinical, often people think, the connection is sterile, detached, cold. That's one way to think about clinical. I use it really in the sense of working from a perspective of observing and treating real patients rather than working in a laboratory or from a theory. So clinical theology is a theology that is born out of praxis of spiritual care or out of a praxis of ministry. And I've learned there's certain perspectives as a clinician that sort of define how I do my work. And for me, that has helped me to develop a method for doing theological reflection, basically. It really determines my method. And it starts with observation about the human condition. Mm-hmm. I don't start with doctrine or with theory, but I look in the clinic when somebody comes in, we don't start with a theory. We ask what's going on. And we start with what patients experience. So I start actually with lived human experience and then seek dialogue, interdisciplinary dialogue. We don't work as in silos in the clinic. Different disciplines work together, and we work for an outcome. It's outcome oriented. It's not theology that is done in the ivory tower. That's how I was trained in Germany. It was theology in the ivory tower. In my work as a chaplain, I've learned to do theological reflection in a purposeful way.
What were some of the first moments that really started to bridge that gap for you of learned theology in the ivory tower, here's the ideas, and then you're actually trying to live it, and you had to really wrestle with, how do I get from here to here into the lived experiences of people? Can you remember sort of when that first started to shift for you and you realized you needed a more localized theology for your work?
Definitely. And I remember the moment, and I think I wrote about it in my preface to the book. It was in my first CPE unit. Because I came from Germany, did my first unit of CPE, and wrote, page-long theological reflection because I just had done my exam and I had all these theological ideas and Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer and everybody on my head. And so I quoted left and right. And my CPE supervisor, a very, very wise man, Clarence Barton, at one point, he sort of read my verbatim record that I wrote. And he said, it's really nice to read about what Bonhoeffer would think about this patient. But I'm really interested what Frank's theology is. And that was the first time that somebody sort of opened that gate for me, or the door to not just quote theologians, but to engage myself in theological reflection and develop that out of my practice.
As you did that, what were the first theological ideas you had to reckon with? What was hardest to bridge that gap between the idea and here's what Bonhoeffer might have thought of this, or here's what Barth would have done, but here's the lived experience for my person, and actually don't know how to bridge that, or I have to do some work to figure out what good news is for this, or how God is present in it?
I think it was, I did that unit of CP in a psychiatric hospital, state psychiatric hospital, so that was completely new for me. I haven't really worked with psychiatric patients or in that kind of environment. And I think the first challenge was to sort of allow, well, I don't know that allow is the right word, but to sort of think that there is the way that those patients experience reality is still a way of experiencing or encountering God. They're not in a different reality, and that they have to be moved out, but that incarnation really means that God enters into that reality too.
Wow, I'm just wrapping my brain around that. But the good news of the incarnation is that your patient's experience of reality, even and especially inside of mental illness and what they're going through, is a space that God is present and incarnates, and a reality for that.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful.
I still experience it. I regularly, we have a psychiatric chaplain that I talk with regularly, a rabbi, and we often come to that point that the psychiatric patients often don't feel heard or listened to because their story get dismissed as psychotic or whatever. It's not real. They experience the world in a way that is not real, meaning that those who are not diagnosed with a mental illness, they define what's real. But their world is very real.
Yeah.
And the gift that Mindy, our chaplain, I think gives to that patients is to really listen to their story and validate that that's their reality. They don't have to stay there. They can still move into a different reality, but for now, that's their reality, and that's the reality that God can enter.
It reminds me of some of the good news I've heard articulated by those who've worked in communities with those, especially of adults with mental disabilities or have physical disabilities, that about how to bring them fully present into the life of the community through sacrament and prayer and being present, and not assuming that there's some barrier for them to experience God, but instead making the assumption that God is so present and so loving that God, of course, is going to work through these means to be present for them, and to not just assume because they're experiencing the world differently than we are, that God can't bridge that gap. So I first discovered your book because I simply Googled the Empathic God, because my assumption was somebody must have written this.
Wow.
I don't think I ever told you that that's how I found you, but I was like, has somebody written a book called this? They must have. And I found it.
And indeed.
The review, and was like, okay, great, I'm in. I ordered it that day, got it that week, and started chewing through it because of just all the writing I've tried to do around empathy and trying to understand this war on empathy, the incarnational reality of an empathic God within that. So I was delighted to find your book. I read it. I was far more delighted because of the rich contextual nature of it and all of the different voices that you bring into this conversation. Where did the empathic nature of God first emerge for you as a theological category? Was it something you encountered in somebody else, or was this part of your work in moving from the ivory tower to the lived experiences of your people and bringing the clinical in, and that seemed a helpful way of describing it?
Well, it was part ivory tower, part clinical. It's really the first time I thought about it. I didn't put it in those words, but it was when I wrote my dissertation, which was on developing a pastoral theological model of the self. The title was The Will to be Known, a pastoral theological model of the self, and that was based on Bonhoeffer's anthropology and Heinz Kohardt's self-psychology. But I studied empathy a lot in that context because for Kohardt, empathy was the treatment method in response to narcissistic personality disorder. He came out of the psychoanalytic tradition, and Freud basically said, narcissistic personalities are not treatable. and gave up. I mean, he said, because they cannot develop the transference that is necessary for psychoanalysis. And Kohut really pioneered the psychoanalytic treatment of narcissistic personality disorder and developed this method where empathy is really the therapeutic response to the narcissistic experience. And he also determined that sort of the narcissistic dilemma at the core of the narcissistic personality is really a deep-seated shame. It's not really too big of a self, but it's not enough self, really a deflated self that then somebody has to compensate for. So in that context, and Bonhoeffer's theology is deeply incarnational. That's what I love about it. That's why I go back to his works over and over again through the years. And so that connection between Bonhoeffer's incarnational theology and then thinking about empathy, I think that's where it first started. But I really didn't make the connection in a way that I made it in the book. That moment came for me in the last in-person conference in 2020 before the pandemic hit. Was a conference for clinical pastoral educators, and we had a keynote speaker, a psychiatrist from Denver, who spoke about neuroplasticity, basically, and how therapy works in the brain and creates new pathways. And in response to that, at that conference, I thought, what would it mean to develop a therapeutic theology that has a similar effect as therapy has, that really affects how restructures pathways in the brain that has that power, and what would be the symbols and the rituals and the language that we would use. And that's really where that connection between the symbol of the incarnation, I call it a symbol of the incarnation, and the therapeutic of practice of empathy sort of combined for me.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's from a different background. It's sort of a similar journey for me into that. And it was encountering my first neurotheologian, another category I didn't know existed, but a neurotheologian who was, trying to understand spiritual formation and the actual rewiring of the brain and the neuroscience behind it, which is none of my background, right? I know nothing about. I have continued to read to try to understand it, but it unlocked something for me in understanding the lived pastoral experience of watching people go through how discipleship worked, how spiritual formation worked, what didn't connect, trying to understand people and their trauma, trying to understand the inability for people to move outside of their preconceived categories of friend versus enemy and all of that. And when that language came in and that some of that science came in of this is actually what it takes to rewire the brain in order to experience compassion and empathy for another, that was where the incarnational theology for me attached to it.
Right. And it's it's neurotheology, and I'm not anywhere of an expert, but I looked at it, as I did my research. It's fascinating, I think. And I knew about it from my clinical work. Because in working particularly with cancer patients, I did the research. I found the research and I applied it to my practice, where hope is, for example, the biochemical process in the brain. It's not just sort of an idea about the future, but if I'm this hope, that something is happening in my brain that affects my body. And there's an anatomy of hope that particularly I found in the work with cancer patients affect outcomes. Not by itself, but in connection with chemotherapy or whatever, immunotherapy.
Yeah, it's the recognition that we are whole creatures, right? Yeah. That we're not brains deciding how we live, and then we have just bodies that carry us around, but all of it's wired together. And of course, good news and God being incarnate helps us make sense of all of that, right? That this is how God's going to be working in and through us. So with your discussion of the empathic nature of God, you do a lot of work talking about the cross and atonement theories. And try to offer a different atonement at-one-ment theory. I liked the word play there. I appreciated that as a wordsmith. And you said, just if I can quote one of the books, you said, traditional models of atonement compose a problem in the way that they raise the question of whether God's love can ultimately be expressed through an act of violence. And so you really, in the book, move away from what happens on the cross being this act of redemptive violence and that being the key to understanding what God's doing in the world, to instead trying to center the Jesus event, the life and the ministry of Jesus and its implications for what that reveals about God. Can you help us understand some of that, unpack some of your movement away from some of those atonement theories and its implications, and what sort of led you in this movement?
Yeah, going back to where I started in terms of claiming my context, I think ultimately all theology is contextual.
Mm-hmm.
Really, all theologies have had a context. The problem is, and I say that somewhere in the book, if context is in the blind spot, then theological accidents can happen and have happened. And I think the classical atonement theologies are an example of those theological accidents. They put redemptive violence at the center of the Jesus event. The cross is part of the story, but it's not the trajectory of the story. I think the cross became elevated because of Paul's very particular story and biography, because he was the first theologian of the church, and he put the cross and the crucified and the resurrected Christ in the center of his theology. And I suspect in part it was because he did not know Jesus alive. He had the mystical experience, the revelation on the Damascus road experience, and that got, I think, picked up by the early church. And I loved going into all the creeds, the section about the creeds in the book, because I really haven't looked at it, but all our Christian creeds really skip the life of Jesus. There is the miraculous birth, and there is the death and the resurrection, and everything that's in between, is not acknowledged as a salvific event. And so I shifted to looking at, under the theme of empathy and the Jesus event as an empathic, salvific, therapeutic event, to look at the life of Jesus that then led, as a consequence, to the death. But I cannot believe, I deal with violence almost on a daily basis. A lot of our trauma patients come from violent trauma, stabbing, beating, a lot of gun violence. So dealing with that, I cannot possibly believe in a God that uses violence for redemptive purposes. So
yeah, I found your framing of that conversation, in which you just dropped a beautiful nugget talking about what's in the background and how the accidents of theology, when you were talking about the context. If the context is in the forefront, that was a brilliant observation. But I think you're framing in the book of having to wrestle with the incarnation as event and what it reveals about God in the same way people want to wrestle with the cross as the revelation of God is really compelling. And I certainly resonated with that because of my own movement into dealing with people who are suffering. And for me,
you've worked with trauma victims, right?
I have worked with trauma victims, and it's never been clinical. It's been far more pastoral, missional work, but also working with nonprofits that were trying to help, especially survivors of trafficking around the globe, and to re-enter into a community, having to figure out what culturally based trauma care looked like, because these were not in North American contexts, right? So now we're also working in different cultures, where the language itself determines partly how people experience and make sense of trauma, right? So that was where, for me, it was, okay, there has to be something, a different articulation of good news, because I believe God is present and with them. But what does that mean? And it was in conversations mainly through listening to the lived experiences of people who had been through scenarios that I don't need to get into the details and name them, but that I could not imagine actual human beings had to live through. And they were the ones articulating how God was present with or working to redeem what they had been through. And I couldn't do that. And that was, for me, sort of the mass expansion of good news and gospel into the life of Christ and God's empathic presence with us and as a witness to our suffering and that work. So when you say, yeah, if you're around violence every day, it's hard to believe that there's the center of what God's work to do to reconcile the world is an act of redemptive violence. Yeah, I'm with you and having a really hard time understanding that and believing that.
Yeah. And you just formulated a clinical approach to theological reflection.
Hey, all right.
Right? That came out of out of your experience. That's the perspective taking.
I'm curious. Have you received pushback as you've named that? Or are there people, what are the challenges people have? Have you received feedback where people are like, wait a second, you just threw away the cross. This is the least Christian thing I can imagine.
Yeah. If you mess with a cross, you mess with for some students, I present it regularly in different contexts to students, not just in our CPE center, but it's like pulling the carpet out under their, feet of faith, and that's what it feels like. And so there has been pushback, but it was really so. We had it this summer. We had a very conservative PhD. He is a PhD student at a very conservative seminary, and he wanted to do CPE with us. I don't know why, because CPE did not match his educational experience at all. But he was not from a North American context, and he came, did CPE with us, and at the graduation ceremony, he really gave me a gift, because he heard my presentation, he argued back, he read the book over the 10 weeks or 12 weeks that the unit went, and then during the graduation ceremony, after the graduation ceremony, he came to me and he said, I want to thank you for showing me that I can develop my own theology. So he believed in my process, not in the content of my book, but he believed in the process of the book. And
he's
going to
create his own that's going to give a different result. But I like the process of what you're doing here. Right. Yeah.
Right. And that was really a gift. Yeah. So, and I'm not asking for people to agree. I just want to enter the conversation.
Yeah.
And again, it's a certain perspective. It's not universally true. I don't claim that universal truth for what I've written. It's a certain perspective.
Yeah. Well, and it's and it is interesting. I know when we first started emailing, you noted the humor that my efforts to do the same thing centered the cross with the idea of cruciformity.
Right.
Whereas yours was pulling away from that. But really, for me, cruciformity was an articulation of what you're trying to name. And what I found really resonant with a transformation of an understanding of the cross, that the cross revealed essentially the full incarnation and the empathy of God through the form which Christ takes within that, but slightly different outcome and perspective, but it was trying to do the same work. But we're like, I remember you responding that of like, interesting that you center the cross in this.
Yeah, it is. Well, but it makes sense in the sense of, when I reread about cruciformity, that idea of that the cross is symbol of God is for us. That's what cruciformity means, right? And that's the empathic God, the God who enters our experience.
Yeah, so give us a little bit of a description then of your articulation of atonement or at-one-ment theory over and opposed to the cross as the wrath of God poured out as, sort of this cosmic wager, right, of the canceling out the debts and what has to happen there. Give us your articulation of that.
Yeah, again, it goes back to the idea of empathy. I think empathy is often misunderstood, and it's certainly misunderstood by those who wage the war on empathy these days. And we think about empathy as an emotion, but it's really not. It might feel certain things when I practice empathy. But empathy is really, for me, it's a clinical skill that can be learned, that can be taught. It's an attitude of engaging, attending to another person and to their experience, and being able to enter into their experience to a degree, not 100%, but to a degree, and understanding what it's like for them. So it's coming alongside, it's joining, coming together, and it's not... I think sometimes we think about empathy as a warm and fuzzy feeling, and that's not what it is. It's that ability, that skill to understand particularly another person's emotional inner world. And so I didn't want to give up the atonement, and that's where the at-one-ment came from as a practice of, on the one hand, it's a different word for incarnation. It really puts the incarnation at the heart and at the center of the Jesus event. Becoming one, entering into the world of humanity fully. And then it becomes in terms of the purposefulness of a theology of at-one-ment, it becomes a guide for practice for me, particularly a practice of spiritual care that participates in God's ongoing work of salvation, because I don't think it's over, and I don't think it means going to heaven, but it means working towards wholeness. And at-one-ment is that practice, empathic practice, God's empathic practice in the incarnation, but then also a ministry that enters into another person's experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. When I was doing work with Ideos, the framework we talked about empathy was an empathic intelligence or wisdom, because it was a learned intelligence, like you're naming. It wasn't just my ability to feel with another, but instead my ability to understand the context, the history, the perspective of someone, and to be able to enter into that in a way that I can understand what reconciliation with them might look like, or what healing for them might look like, or how sacrificial love for them might look like because of this, and to be present for them. So I think that in of itself is just us learning to have an incarnate gospel for others as God did for us, to step into our stories, into our lived experience, to be present with, to absorb, and to shape a good news for us to be whole, to be healed, to be reconciled, to move to that.
Yeah, and to communicate the acceptance, God's care. Yeah, so at the heart, I think what I haven't named is, and it goes back probably to your question about when do you first thought about empathy, is also about how do we think about the human condition, and how traditional atonement theories have thought about the human condition, because they have basically named and identified guilt as the human predicament, that humanity became guilty by transgressing in the garden against God's command, and that became a chronic condition. And Augustine named it then as original sin, and that stuck with us. And again, clinically, and in my work with students, I have experienced that shame is so much more a defining experience rather than guilt. And that's also where I thought if salvation is a response to the human condition, then we need a different response than forgiveness, because shame is not affected by forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't do anything for shame.
Yeah.
To heal shame. The therapeutic response to heal shame is empathy. So if the Jesus event is a salvific response to the human condition, then I had to think about how is it about empathy? I have to interpret that event through the lens of empathy, because it cannot be primarily about forgiveness, because if the human condition is not about guilt.
No, I reread these chapters, helping us looking at shame and guilt several times, and brought it into some conversation with some of my community, just working it through with some of the other studies we've been doing lately. And I thought this delineation between shame and guilt, and what the atonement for those are, what the healing for those are, unlocked a lot of this. In that if we are only concerned about assuaging our guilt, being forgiven, canceling a debt, then a transaction can do that. A judgment can do that. It can be, okay, move on. But it doesn't actually wrestle with the implications of what's happened, or who you are, or how you feel, or what's broken within you. It's not necessarily restorative. It's just a removal of guilt. Whereas with shame, which is about, as you articulate, who I am,
right?
What's broken with me, I'm broken. It's not just what I've done. This is me. I'm the issue. That we can oftentimes have an atonement theory or have an understanding of God that never once begins to address that, because the reason we had the debt to begin with is that we're so broken and shameful, and God can't stand us. God can't be in our presence. That doesn't really change, except God just decides, okay, I'll accept you because of this other thing. But it doesn't actually get to the work of shame in our life, which is what needs the healing.
You say it well. No, exactly.
So help us ashamed more, please.
So,
yeah.
No, guilt, I think I like your way. I mean, the word transaction, is that guilt can be resolved through a transaction. Shame needs a relationship.
What else clinically is attached to that shame, as far as what can be healed then through empathy and this empathic witness of God? What are you able to heal or address by providing that and addressing shame that guilt can't do?
So somebody has said shame is the emotion that wants to make us hide. So clinically, it's a praxis of inviting somebody to come out of hiding, and that typically happens gradually. And part of it is, in my experience, it has been to be vulnerable with another person, to model some of that, to model that making myself known to somebody, not in an inappropriate way, not making it about myself, but to bring myself into the conversation, not to be detached, but to make myself available to another person and to let them know that, or communicate acceptance as I listen to their story. But ask a few more questions. Maybe I can.
Yeah, I'm just
get
trying to
some more to it.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to translate this thinking about somebody who's just working in like maybe a local church context. And they're thinking about, okay, so as we're thinking about how we embody good news, how we shape our community, are we merely trying to address guilt, or are we doing a deeper work of helping people find good news and healing for their shame? And it's not going to be in a therapeutic setting. It's not going to be this clinical setting and that more formally, but it's going to be a community of love and acceptance, attachment, these sorts of ideas. What does that begin to look like, or what could the community hope to do, right, to help people, be discovered, to not hide from that shame?
Right. I'm working on a follow-up manuscript right now on of the book, and it's about becoming an empathic church.
Fantastic.
So translating it's some about what I've written for the clinical context or for the clinical work of spiritual care, to say, what does it mean for church? And part of it, I'm writing a chapter right now. I call it intersectional listening, both listening to the sacred stories, the sacred incarnational stories in Scripture, both in the Hebrew Scripture and in Christian Scripture, and listening to the mundane stories of people. And I think where churches can become healing agents in response to shame is if churches can create spaces, and that won't be, I don't think that it could be large spaces, but spaces where people can tell their story, because often we hide I think people hide their story. Mm-hmm. If churches can create storytelling circles in whatever way that, can look like, I think that depends on the structure of the church, the culture of the church. Storytelling churches where people can be known, and by telling their story also make meaning of what happened to them. And that, I think it would take some skillful facilitation, but that can be taught. I think empathic group leadership, I think that would be one way how people, apart from, individual counseling, where people in community can find healing for their shame. And often there's trauma in the background of shame.
Mm-hmm. This is the recurring theme that as we've talked to a number of different people in peacemaking work, conflict transformation work, intergenerational work, of storytelling, how to listen well, how to be present to one another. I had a great conversation with some Mennonite leaders around some of their storytelling and listening practices and communal discernment, that over and over again, the power of that, of people being able to articulate their story, share it with others, to have it received, to be held well, it has a power. It has a redemptive power to it. There's just no question about it. No, that's really helpful. And I really look forward to my 4-part review and interaction with the next book. I'm already excited about that one, and thinking about this for Life of the Church within that. Well, Frank, thank you so much for this book, for your work, the really honest way in which you, I think, sort of present this within your context. I find it exceptionally helpful. Yeah. I know others will as well, but I'm really thankful for it.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for picking it up and really digging into it and for making that contact. That's exactly why I wrote it. I wrote it to have the conversation, not to make people into believers.
Yeah,
but to have the conversation.
That's beautiful. Well, I'll make sure in the show notes if you want to connect with Frank, he's got a website. I'll make sure the links for the book are in there as well. And so if you're interested in following up, reading, connecting, booking Frank for one of his lectures, you can find a way to contact him and talk to them there. So thanks so much for your time, Frank, and look forward to continuing to interact with your work.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for listening to Cruciform Conversations. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube. and to visit the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com.